The New Orleans Conference, the world's greatest investment event.
So I would like you now to welcome Milton Friedman speaking on the economy of the United States and the world, and it's a great honor to welcome the greatest living economist, Milton Friedman.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate that introduction, and it's nice to be here on Jim Blanchard's 25th New Orleans Conference. I don't know why it's all called New Orleans. I once was at a Blanchard conference in Montreal. There's an enormous amount of hype going around about the so-called global crisis. You people have been exposed to it for the past few days. The world has been exposed to it for as equally long or a longer time. The most recent example I came across was in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this past Thursday. It was an op-ed by Judy Shelton, and here's what she said, quote, "With the world teetering on the edge of a financial cliff and staring into the dark abyss below." She was hyping the existing situation in behalf of something that many of you in this room would approve of, a gold standard. But the Treasury Department and the administration have been hyping it for weeks in behalf of a cause that most of us would disapprove of, which is to provide an additional $18 billion of your money to the International Monetary Fund. But for whatever reason it's being hyped, whether for a good cause or a bad cause, it's simply a bunch of nonsense. There is no world crisis. We are not teetering on the edge of a financial cliff. There is no abyss below. If you just look at what the facts are, just take a tour around the world. The United States accounts for something like 35% of the world's GNP. We're in pretty good shape. We've got relatively low unemployment. We've got relatively low inflation. Our output has been going up more slowly than during earlier recoveries, but nonetheless, rather steadily and for a long period. We're at the end of one of the longest cyclical expansions in the post-war period. We may face a recession next year. You know, one thing economists cannot do is to predict the short-run movements of the economy. And anybody who tells you that he knows that on a certain particular date the economy is going to start to come down, don't buy any Brooklyn Bridge from him. But on the whole, the United States is in pretty good shape. The same thing is true of the continent of Europe, of Great Britain. They are in good shape. They're on the continent, their unemployment rates are high, but they've been high for the past 10 years or so because they have adopted too rigid a system of regulations and controls. But on the whole, they're in reasonably prosperous state. They're not on the edge of any kind of a financial cliff. Between the two, you've got about 75% of the world. There's 25% left. Now that 25%, there are a few very bad trouble spots. There's Russia on the one hand, there's Japan and East Asia on the other. Those are the trouble spots. But they are not a source of a major collapse for the world economy. Similarly, there's a lot of talk about how this financial crisis is going to produce worldwide deflation, depression. We're on the edge of another 1929 to 33. The world may not learn very much from history, but it does learn something. And one lesson that has been learned is that we know how to avoid deflation. The way to avoid deflation is to print money. If you print enough money, you won't have deflation. If you print too much money, you'll have inflation. That lesson has been learned. 29 to 33, the Great Depression will not be repeated. In 1954, what is that? That's 44 years ago. I gave a talk in Stockholm under the title, Why the American Economy is Depression-Proof. Now, I've been right for 44 years, and I don't see any reason to change my mind now. We are not going to have a depression. The world is not going to have a depression. That doesn't say that Russia isn't in a terrible situation, and it doesn't say that Japan is not in a terrible situation. It doesn't say that we may not have many ups and downs in our stock markets and other kind of markets, but we are not facing a major worldwide depression, or for that matter, a major United States depression. If you look at what the facts are, the one place in the world where you can reasonably talk of real deflation is in Japan, where prices, internal prices, have been going down because Japan has been following a very bad monetary policy ever since 1990. And Japan has had about 7 years of stagnation or worse. In the 6 years before the 1990, Japanese national income grew 30% in total. In the past 6 years, it's grown something like 5%. That has essentially been stagnation. And the reason has fundamentally been because Japanese central bank has been following a very restrictive monetary policy. It hasn't done as badly as the U.S. Federal Reserve did in the 1930s. From 1929 to 1933, the quantity of money in the United States was allowed to decline by a third. So there was only, for every $3 in existence in 1929, there were only $2 in 1933, and 1/3 of the banks had gone broke. Now, Japan hasn't done quite as badly as that. They had money supply growing at something like 13% a year in 1990. In the next 2 years, it did decline a little. They stepped hard on the brake to break that bubble that they were in, and they haven't taken their foot really off the brake since. Japan offers a fascinating experiment in a Keynesian approach to cyclical policy. What is the advice that our Treasury has been giving to Japan? The government should spend more and tax less. You should create a deficit and in that way get the economy moving. Well, they've tried that 5 times in the last 7 years and it hasn't worked. And there's no reason why it should work. What Japan needs to do, in my opinion, is to cut tax rates for supply-side reasons, not demand-side reasons, and increase the rate of monetary growth. And that would, I think, be a more effective process. If you look at the United States and try to judge what's happening to inflation or deflation, it's extremely important to distinguish between what economists call traded goods and non-traded goods. Traded goods are those that are imported or exported that are the subject of international trade, mostly commodities of various kinds. Non-traded goods are things like services, rents, things that are domestic and that are not involved in international trade. Thanks to the East Asian crisis, we have been getting the bonanza of relatively cheap imports, low-priced imports. On the other hand, our service sector has been going along swimmingly. If you break down our consumer price index for the last year, the average increase in consumer prices as measured was 1.6%. If you separate that out into commodities on the one hand and services on the other, the average increase in the price of commodities was 0. The average increase in the price of services was 3%. That's hardly deflation. Two things have triggered the recent hysteria. One is Russia, and the other is the Asian crisis. So far as Russia is concerned, we all heard that wonderful talk by Margaret Thatcher yesterday, and the one thing she failed to mention about well, I guess she did mention it, about what's wrong in the case of Russia, was that the Western world bribed Russia to follow bad economic policies. Nobody put it that way, but that was the effect. What happens if you take a country that has to make substantial and serious changes in the way it runs its economy, and you start pouring money into it, as the International Monetary Fund and the Western countries did? The effect of that is to encourage them to go on as they were before and not to take those measures that were needed in order to try to move towards something more like a market economy. To this day, there's a very limited amount of real privatization in Russia. Most of agriculture, of the production of food, is still in the form of government collective. In the large industries, you've had not privatization of a kind that introduces responsibility, but a turning over to political cronies. And we of the West must bear some responsibility for that. One of the most amusing things recently was to have I believe it was the new prime minister of Russia, or maybe it was their foreign minister, who said that because the IMF had done so much harm by giving them so much money and encouraging them to postpone the real medicine, the IMF owed them some more money. In any event, Russia is at the moment, is from an economic point of view, a relatively unimportant part of the world. Politically, it's extremely important because it has nuclear weapons. But economically, it's relatively unimportant. And while it will have very serious difficulties, and I certainly am no expert on what they ought to do about that, that will not contaminate the rest of the world. The Asian crisis is in many ways more interesting. It's been attributed, there's been a great deal of talk about how the Asian crisis has been a result of a market failure. Too much hot money. The wicked speculators have been going in there and destroying countries one after another. Now, this is a story we have heard time and time again. Whenever governments do things that have bad consequences, you can be sure that they will attribute it to a market failure, when in fact the source of the problems is not market failure but government failure. And the speculators, far from doing harm, have been doing good. As in so many cases, the government failures have to do with the way in which they handled the monetary and banking situation. The government failure is clear, as we've already seen in Russia. It's clear, as we've already seen in Japan, where the government failure in Japan was a result of the Bank of Japan behaving in roughly the same way that the Federal Reserve System did from 29 to 33, though in a less extreme form. The East Asian countries like Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on, are a different case. There, the primary source of the government failure is the IMF. I'll elaborate on that, but let me just put it in this way. In my opinion, if the IMF had not existed, there would not have been an East Asian crisis. Now, let me see if I can make that analysis understandable, if I can explain what I am talking about. The difficulties in Japan did make trouble for the East Asian countries, because Japan, of course, is the largest economic power in the East Asia. It was the largest importer from and exporter to the other countries there. It was the largest source of credit there. So Japan's difficulties did impose troubles upon the East Asian countries. But what really brought them down was the combination of the IMF behavior, which led to a flood of hot money, and the structure, the fact that they adopted a system of pegging their exchange rates to the US dollar while maintaining an independent central bank. Let me start by telling a brief story about the International Monetary Fund. As most of you know, it was established in 1944 to 45 as part of the Bretton Woods Agreement, setting up a system of pegged exchange rates among a group of countries. The IMF was set up for one purpose and one purpose only. Its purpose and its function was to monitor this system of pegged exchange rates, the Bretton Woods system, whereby the United States agreed to buy and sell gold at $35 an ounce, and other countries agreed to peg their currencies to the US dollar. That system broke down and collapsed on August 15, 1971, when President Nixon, as part of a broad economic program, including price and wage controls, closed the gold window. That is, it said the United States will no longer abide by its commitment to buy and sell gold at $35 an ounce. I may say that action should have been taken earlier. The commitment was an undesirable commitment in the first place, and by the time President Nixon became president, it should have been abandoned. Indeed, I have to admit that I wrote him a memo before he came into office, urging him that the first thing he should do on coming into office was to close the gold window. Interestingly enough, if I may go back to your speaker of yesterday, Margaret Thatcher, the first thing Margaret Thatcher did on coming into office was to abolish exchange controls and set the pound free to be determined in the market. And in my opinion, it was the most important single action during her term of office. If Nixon had done that in 1971, the world, 70, world would, or 68, the world would have been a lot better off. At any rate, the end of Bretton Woods was formally recognized in 1973, when it was just terminated. In any reasonable world, in any reasonable circumstances, the IMF should have been closed down too. It no longer had any function. But when was the last government agency you knew of that closed shop when it no longer had any reason for existence? I don't believe there's anything more permanent than a temporary government agency. At any rate, the IMF was sitting on a bunch of money and started to look around for something it could do. And at first, it turned itself into a consulting agency for countries that had problems. But unlike most consulting agencies, charge fees when they come to consult. But here was the IMF. It didn't charge a fee. Indeed, it brought money. It paid you to let them consult for them. And so it was a very popular consulting agency. And it proceeded to give advice to many countries around the world, and in the process to make them loans at below market interest rates and under favorable terms. Much of the advice they gave was very good. The IMF hired excellent economists. Some of them, in fact, were students of mine or former colleagues. But that changed. That minor role of being a sort of a consulting agency was escalated when you had in 1995 the Mexican crisis. And when, together with the United States, thanks to Mr. Clinton having available the Economic Stabilization Fund in the Treasury, they cobbled together a $50 billion package, supposedly to bail out Mexico from its temporary liquidity difficulties. That was on a larger scale than anything that had been done before, and I must say, it had a great success, not in bailing out Mexico. Don't kid yourself about that. Mexico, after the so-called bailout and after the stabilization, had a very severe recession. The average income of the Mexican is lower today than it was before this all happened. But it was a successful bailout of whom? It bailed out the banks and the financial institutions around the world that had loaned money to Mexico in dollars, bought testabonos and the kind of bonds that Mexico put out. Now, don't misunderstand me. This has gotten the term moral hazard. But I don't think there's anything immoral about accepting a gift somebody offers you. And if the IMF offered the banks and the lenders a gift, if they said, we'll pay back to you those loans that you made at very high interest rates because they were supposedly risky, you can't blame anybody for taking that money. But what it did was to establish a widespread expectation that the IMF would in the future insure lenders against currency risk. What they were doing essentially was to offer international financial institutions involved in lending, they were offering them an insurance policy for nothing, insurance against currency risk. How does that tie into East Asia? Because that was a major factor that led to a great flow of funds into the East Asian countries. There was good reason for the flow of funds. Some of it, the East Asian countries had been making great progress. They had been moving toward freer markets, although with much more political control and favoritism than was desirable, and they had been showing very high rates of growth. They continued to have central banks, but under the encouragement of the IMF, they had pegged their currencies to the dollar. Now, there are three ways in which any country can manage its external financial arrangements. Three ways and only three ways. You can have a really, truly fixed exchange rate, a unified currency. You can have a pegged exchange rate, and you can have a floating exchange rate. A unified currency is what we have in the United States. The same dollar in Louisiana as in Michigan, as in California, as in New York. That's a unified currency. That's what the European countries are going to introduce beginning next year with the euro, in which the countries, 11 countries that are involved in the euro, will all have identically the same currency. It's what Panama has with the United States. Panama has a bolivar, but one bolivar equals $1, and dollars freely circulate. A very close relative to that is what Hong Kong and Argentina have in the form of a currency board. The key feature to all those arrangements, whether they be good, bad, or indifferent, is that there's only one central bank for one currency. In effect, the Federal Reserve System is a central bank On the other hand, when Thailand had a pegged currency, if Thailand had a current account deficit, instead of reducing the amount of money, it had an alternative. It could draw on its reserves, or it could borrow dollars from abroad, and in that way peg the exchange rate without making those internal adjustments that were required by the change in its external situation. Then it's always tempting when a problem arises to say, oh, this is very temporary, we'll get over it very rapidly. And it's tempting, therefore, to use these expedients of drawing on your reserves. That's fine as long as everything goes well. But it has the result that it allows these temporary discrepancies to accumulate into big ones. Little problems become big ones. And then the kind of small changes in exchange rate that would have worked no longer will work, and you have what you had in Thailand. Where do the speculators come in? Well, under a pegged exchange rate system, they get a one-way deal. It's always clear when the country gets into trouble which way it's going to go. It was clear that if Thailand did anything, it would devalue. If a speculator sells Thailand currency under those circumstances short, he may lose interest and commissions, but he won't have any currency loss, because if they don't devalue, the exchange rate will be what it was. And therefore, that's a temptation to bring in speculators. Are they doing harm? No, they're doing good. If they force the country to face up to its problems sooner than it otherwise would, that's a good thing. Would it really have been desirable for more bad bank lending within Thailand to occur, for more skyscrapers for which there's no demand to have been built? It would have been bad. In any event, it was the existence of this kind of a pegged exchange rate and the encouragement which the IMF gave to the inflow of hot money that was responsible for the East Asian crisis. The third exchange rate arrangement is a system of floating exchange rates. A clean float, all exchange rates are determined in private markets. Under a dirty float, the central bank occasionally intervenes, but it doesn't announce in advance any particular peg or value that it's going to stick to. That's the system that most of the major countries of the world have adopted since 1971. The United States, Great Britain, Japan, all have floating exchange rates. Now, the most interesting proposition: no country with either a unified currency or a floating exchange rate has ever had a balance of payments crisis. It cannot. Since the exchange rate is determined in the market, the buyers and the sellers always clear accounts. When trouble arises, small changes in exchange rates adapt to them and make it unnecessary to have these very large crises. Japan is an excellent example. Japan's in terrible shape. It has real problems internally, but it doesn't have any balance of payments crisis. It's interesting. How is it that New Zealand and Australia were never infected by the Asian crisis? Because both have floating exchange rates. If in a world in which you have floating exchange rates or unified currencies, there's no role for the IMF to play. There are no foreign exchange crises. There's nothing for it to do. So it's not an accident that the IMF has been in favor of pegged exchange rates. I've given a fairly quick and fast tour of the world, and I want to leave as much time as possible for questions and answers. But I do want to cover one more topic that I think is of extraordinary interest and that I think you want to keep your eyes on. And that's the introduction of the euro in the European continent next year. This is a gamble of the most extreme kind. It's unprecedented in history. There is no case that I know of in which many individual national countries maintaining central banks have used the same currency. People analogize it to the gold standard, and it does have some resemblance to the gold standard, which prevailed from 1879 to 1914. I might say, for the benefit of all of you gold people here, that's the only period when you ever had something approximating a real gold standard. But it's different, because under the gold standard, individual countries could break the link with gold. They could change the price of gold. Individual countries had exit strategies. Under the euro, in which 11 countries are supposedly going to have a single central bank, the European Central Bank, using the same currency, there is no exit strategy. How does a country that doesn't like it get out of it? They've thrown away the key. They are committed. And they are, in my opinion, making a big gamble, and it's going to be fascinating to see how it works out. The United States is a good place for a single currency for the separate states and so on, because all of the people in the country speak some approximation to the same language. There's free movement between the various parts of the country so that people can adjust. If something happens that affects one state, as the oil crisis affected Texas, you can have a flow of people from Texas out and from outside Texas in. You'll have a very large central government compared to local governments. There's a flow of funds that way. The 11 countries that are joined in the euro are altogether different. They speak 11 different languages. There's very little movement of people from one another. The exchange rate between their currencies gave them a way of adjusting to things that affected one country differently from another. The only mechanism they are retaining for that purpose is changes in prices and wages, and yet all of them have systems of big governments, of rigid regulations, of rigid control of wages and prices. They do not have an effective adjustment mechanism. And it's a very poor situation for a common currency. It's to the United States' advantage that worked. A prosperous Europe is good for the United States. But I think it's a real gamble whether it will work. I hope it does. But I think it's an experiment that economists are going to watch with great interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Friedman. We do have a list of questions. Are you ready?
Sure, I'm ready.
We're going to start with the general and move toward the specific. And someone has asked, what do you think of the current winner of the Nobel Prize, and who do you think deserves the Nobel Prize in economics today?
Well, I hate to get involved in these ad hominem comparisons. Amartya Sen has a great reputation among economists. He's worked in a field that I haven't particularly worked in, and he's had a particular view in that field that I don't particularly share. But I think in all surveys of economists, speaking for the opinion of the professional economists, all surveys of economists, Amartya Sen ranked fairly high. However, I agree very much with an editorial, with an op-ed piece that they had in the Wall Street Journal, that Peter Bauer has contributed much more to the understanding of how to handle the development of underdeveloped countries than Amartya Sen has, and would have been a more appropriate recipient. I may say that the Nobel Committee asks prior Nobel laureates to nominate people for the Nobel Prize. And my nominee was Bauer and not Sen.
Right. I think a lot of us agree with that. And going a bit further back into history, Dr. Skousen asks, and I'm sure he wants a one-word answer, but I'd rather have an expansive one. Who was the greater economist, von Mises or Keynes?
There is no question that in the long-run history of economics, Keynes was a greater economist. Mr. Skousen, Mark Skousen won't like that answer. There are probably a lot of people in this room who want, but I believe you got to be honest.
Okay.
My most interesting experience was with von Mises, which has nothing to do with my answer to this question.
Right.
Was in 1947 at the first meeting of the Montpellier Society in Montpellier in Switzerland, when we were having a discussion of inequalities of income. And in the room there were all those noted socialists like Lionel Robbins, Frank Knight, Aaron Director, George Stigler, and myself, all those, and von Mises. In the middle of the discussion, von Mises got up and said, "You're all a bunch of socialists," and walked out of the room.
Wow. And here is a question, I bet you will not like the premise, but I would be interested in the answer anyway. If you were dictator of America, that's the premise, what laws would you change here?
First law I would change would be the law that establishes dictatorship.
As an outside observer, then, which laws would you advocate being changed?
Anything that reduced the amount of money the government spent and the amount of money it took from people. I have always said I'm in favor of tax cuts whenever you can get them, in what shape, what form, what not. Because the only way to hold down the size of government is to keep down the amount of money it has to spend.
And here, I guess, is probably the most general question of all. You've lived a long life. What's the most important lesson you've learned from history?
The most important lesson I've learned from history is to be so lucky as to find yourself the right wife.
That's a wonderful answer. Your opinion of Margaret Thatcher was implied in some of the things you said, but how will she go down in history? Is there another person of her stature in the wings somewhere?
I don't know about the future, but so far as the past is concerned, I have no doubt that she and Ronald Reagan will go down in history as having done more than any other two individuals to change the climate of opinion and practice within the world. But let me emphasize, we must distinguish between rhetoric and reality. In terms of rhetoric, in terms of what people say, everybody's in favor of free markets, everybody's in favor of competition. 25, 30, 40, 50 years ago, that was not the case. People then were talking about the virtues of central planning, of centralized control. In terms of rhetoric, we have won the battle, as it were. That was sealed with the fall of the Berlin Wall. But in terms of practice, governments are larger and more intrusive today than they were 40 or 50 years ago. In terms of practice, we have been continuing to lose the war. Now, I don't regard that as necessarily a pessimistic sign. History shows over centuries that there's a long lag, a long time delay between changes in rhetoric and changes in practice. Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Britain repealed the Corn Laws in 1820s or 30s, I've forgotten the exact date, but about 30 or 40 years ago, before. The Fabian Socialist Party was formed at the end of the 19th century, in the 1880s, if I remember rightly. Britain started turning to socialism around 1910. So there's a long delay, and the change in the rhetoric will, I believe, change practice. But it will change practice only if we can establish a public opinion and a public attitude that will force a decline in the size of government. And the most effective way of doing that, to go back, is to cut down the amount of money they have to spend.
Now we're getting into specifics of various countries and currency situations. Here's a question on Asia and gold combined. Mark Mobius, Templeton's expert on Asia, advocates a gold-backed currency called the Asian. Do you agree? What is the solution to the Asian currency crisis? You've touched on that, but what do you think of the gold-backed Asia as competition?
I don't know what gold-backed Asian currencies are. You know, for those who really want a gold standard, there's nothing to stop them from having it. There's nothing to stop anybody in this room from making an arrangement with anybody else in this room or out of this room in which you will trade your services for his services in terms of ounces of gold instead of pieces of paper. But that isn't what an gold-backed Asian currency is. That's going to be a fractional gold currency. It's going to be a currency in which you have a reserve of gold and then a lot of money issued on the basis of it. And fractional reserve currencies like that are, like pegged exchange rates, a recipe for trouble. So if any of the countries want to adopt it, that's their business. I'm not trying to tell them what to do, but I would say that that's a non-starter. And it's a non-starter for a reason that seems not to be recognized by people who are concerned about gold. As a medium of circulation, an interest-bearing medium of circulation will dominate a non-interest-bearing medium of circulation. That's how you got into our present situation. You started out with goldsmiths who were storing and warehousing gold and giving people certificates for the storehouse of gold. And those could be exchanged. But then, obviously, they found a way in which they could issue more certificates than they had gold. And then they could make loans on which they could get interest. And then they could pay interest to depositors. An interest-bearing medium of circulation drove out a non-interest-bearing, didn't drive out, but dominated a non-interest-bearing circulating medium. It happened recently in the United States when we had a law which prohibited the payment of interest on demand deposits. You had money market accounts develop in order to be able to find a substitute way in which you could pay interest on demand deposits. And of course, banks found ways to pay interest on demand deposits by rendering all sorts of so-called free services. That's what the real problem is when you try to think about an honest-to-God gold standard. I once wrote an article under the title of Real and Pseudo Gold Standards. And most of the people who advocate gold standards are, in my opinion, advocating pseudo gold standards. A gold reserve bank in the United States, where was it? Kansas City or St. Louis? What? Louis? St. Louis, wherever it was. Some years back, Conrad Braun, tried to establish a system of trading using gold for a circulating medium. It didn't take hold. And so I'm not I don't have very high hopes for an Asian gold currency.
Okay. In regard to that, Hong Kong has recently been intervening in their stock market, considering they used to be laissez-faire. What is the country that best suits your philosophy of freedom?
Well, Hong Kong, in terms of its attitude toward imports, exports, controls, and so on, is still the freest country in the world. There's no doubt about that. But it was made a terrible mistake when it intervened into the market. I called it insane in an interview I had with an Asian Wall Street Journal correspondent. Hong Kong spent decades building up a reputation for a place in which you could borrow and lend money and so on, and be pretty darn sure that the government wasn't going to interfere with you. And they threw it away in a day in what I considered was a very ill-considered movement. Now, Hong Kong is a bit of a problem because in 1983 they did introduce an effective currency board. But over the years, they made some what seemed like minor changes in it, which introduced central banking elements into the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. And it was those, I believe, that caused them trouble more recently and led to the thing. But Hong Kong is still, at the moment, as long as I'm not very optimistic for the long term. I've always said that I don't believe that the Chinese talk about one country, two systems is tenable. I believe it will be one country, one system. The real question is, will the system be the Hong Kong system, or will it be the mainland Chinese system? It's not entirely clear. Mainland Chinese has made tremendous progress in the last 20 years. Rose and I were there in 1980. We were there again in 1988 and again in 1993. And in that period of time, there were tremendous changes to visible to the naked eye in what was happening. You had China behave very differently from Russia. In Russia, you had political reform without real economic reform. In China, you had economic reform without political reform. Neither of those is viable. Sooner or later, you will either have the economic reform come to a halt, or you will have political reform and real element of free society. And I'm very encouraged in the case of China that you may be going in that direction. Margaret Thatcher referred yesterday to the development of voting in the villages and in the provinces, and the emerging from the bottom up of a move toward a greater degree of democracy. But nonetheless, at the moment, it looks like it will sooner or later be the Chinese system and not the Hong Kong system. So I'm not expressing optimism about the long-term prospects of Hong Kong, but as of the moment, it remains the freest economy in the world.
Okay. I just have two new questions here, and I have a couple more after that, but these are from businessmen who actually take the currency risk on a couple of these continents we've been discussing. So I'd like to ask them, these are very practical questions from people on the front lines now. You have my deepest respect for your ideas, but I am a Mexican businessman, and my company would have gone broke, as well as 90% of the companies of my colleagues, if the USA had not helped out 4 years ago. May I very sincerely remind you that Mexico is the second biggest country buying goods from the U.S., creating millions of jobs in the nation. Shouldn't we have bailed out Mexico in that situation?
The answer is no. The Mexican problem was not produced by the United States. It was a Mexican problem. The IMF may have contributed to it, but it did not make it inevitable. There were measures that could have been taken at that time by Mexico that would have reduced the harm. I believe that the bailout, that despite what this gentleman says, I have enough confidence in his ability as a businessman that his prediction would not have been satisfied. You know, the greatest enemies of free markets are two groups: my fellow intellectuals and your fellow businessmen. Every intellectual wants freedom for himself, but not for other people. Every businessman wants freedom for other people, but not himself. He wants the government to come in and help him out. He wants the U.S. government to come in and extend credit to Mexico. I don't blame him. We're all human beings. We all promote our own objectives. But if we're going to get a free society, we must recognize where the problems come and not just give in to them.
And here from another part of the world, many Australian exporters have lost their markets in Southeast Asia because of the collapsed currencies there, especially Thailand and Indonesia. Do you claim that Australia and New Zealand are unaffected by the Asian crisis?
They're not unaffected, no. They're affected, but they aren't part of the Asian crisis. They haven't experienced a foreign exchange crisis. But of course, we're affected by the Asian crisis insofar as the demand for the goods and services we produce have been reduced. In that famous phrase, no country is an island to itself. And so, but you have to distinguish the monetary aspects, the financial aspects of the problem, from the physical and real aspects of the problem. And of course, Australia and New Zealand have been significantly affected by the collapse of East Asia.
Okay. I have about 5 more questions, so I'd like to request we can go a little beyond noon, maybe to 12:05, because this is too great an opportunity to pass up to have Dr. Friedman here. You mentioned abolition of the IMF along with Bretton Woods, which created it. Do you see the possibility of the development of a new Bretton Woods meeting with some kind of a new IMF being developed out of it?
There's a lot of talk about that, but I doubt that it will ever happen.
And regarding speculators being good, is one of the things you said during your talk. Is the bond and currency market we see being speculated on by Soros and the like now in the role of gold as disciplining governments that go beyond the pale in inflation and policy? Are the speculators the ones who are now acting the policemen that gold used to do?
No. The speculators are playing a minor role. It's a very useful role. It's a very short-term role. The long-term trends are not being determined by speculators. They're being determined by the fundamentals. Short-run movements up and down, yes, but not the long-run movements.
Okay. And a couple on taxes. One is really global. Do you see any sign of a chance of repealing the 16th Amendment, the income tax amendment?
I am very dubious. There is a big movement, as some of you know, of a group originating in, I guess it's centered in Texas, for what they call, who want to substitute a retail sales tax for the income taxes. I wish them luck, but I think the chances are very, very small that you will be able to repeal the income tax amendment.
Then the second question on that, probably more practical, is what are the chances for some real tax reform, such as a flat tax or national sales tax?
Close to zero. And the reason for that is very simple. You and I think of taxes as a way to raise money to run the government. But if you were a congressman, you would think of taxes in a very different way. You would think of them as a way to get campaign funds. And if you have a simple flat tax, which would be a very good thing, don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, on the contrary. If you have a simple flat tax, what does a congressman have to sell? Right now, he can sell his influence in stopping a bad tax measure or in putting in a special loophole or not closing a loophole. The most treasured positions in the House of Representatives is on the Ways and Means Committee. If you look at the evidence, the average contributions received by members of the Ways and Means Committees for campaign purposes are larger than for other congressmen. And for a very simple reason. They have a good product to sell. Are they going to destroy that product? Well, it'll take a miracle before that'll happen.
And with 3 more questions. Let's try this one. You've said that deflation is easy to fix. You just print money. But this person says all money is created through the act of borrowing. So if people don't want to borrow, don't you leave an impossible situation in which deflation continues?
It is not true that all money is created by borrowing. That's simply wrong. When you had pure gold coins, they weren't created by borrowing. When the Federal Reserve prints pieces of money, it doesn't necessarily distribute them by borrowing. Let me put it in the simplest way. The Federal Reserve is part of the government. There's this talk about it's private. It's not private. That's just window dressing, fiction. So leave the Federal Reserve out. When the government prints money and uses that money to pay its workers, its employees, is that borrowing? I don't think so.
All right, here's looks like the handwriting of Dr. Skousen again, so it's one of those questions.
I thought he asked the question about Keynes versus Mises.
Yes, he did. Last year you said the solution to Japan was to print more money. Why didn't you support tax cuts and banking deregulation? Won't reinflation make matters worse?
I do support tax cuts and banking regulation, of course. But we're talking about a short-run situation, and the only thing that can have any significant difference in the short run is a more expansive monetary system. Excuse me, but this thing has fallen out of my pocket.
Oh, you can leave it right there. With the U.S. dollar as the de facto world currency, how do we now judge money supply as a cause of inflation in the U.S.?
There is a real problem there because a considerable fraction of U.S. currency is held abroad. But U.S. currency is a minor part of the broader money supply. And M2 and M3 are still pretty good measures of what's happening to the domestic money supply. Moreover, the Fed is statisticians are getting better measures of the amount of currency abroad. So maybe we can get a better measurement of the domestic money supply. Moreover, you are going to have the sense in which the dollar is a de facto world money is not necessarily in the sense of actual currency or deposits being used. It's in the sense of transactions being denominated in dollars or ultimately settled in dollars. And that doesn't affect the relation between the domestic money supply and domestic income and prices.
Okay. And I finally come to the last question. I did get through them thanks to Dr. Friedman's very succinct answers. This is a succinct question. It's only 3 words long, and I believe that if we were speaking to our children of the next generation, we would love to hear Milton Friedman's answer to this simple question. Define economic freedom.
Economic freedom is the freedom of individuals to use their own resources in accordance with their own values, so long as in doing so, they do not interfere with the similar rights of others.
I think that's a wonderful note to conclude on. Please thank Dr. Milton Friedman for joining us in this conference.